Dwarkesh Patel, welcome to the podcast. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on, Danny.
So I'd love to start with high school 2018. I stumbled across a debate
Oh no.
speech that you gave. And the topic of the speech was, should we expect the bull market to continue?
Yeah. So that's hilarious. You found that actually. That's amazing. Um, uh, the context of that was in high school. I did debate, and one of the events in speech and debate is extemporaneous speaking. So you get 30 minutes to prepare a 7-minute speech, and so that was the output of that. So you just pull out a question out of a hat, and the question I pulled out was, "Will the bull market continue?" We don't have a bull market now, so I guess it didn't continue.
But if you extrapolate the trend a little bit further, what I found interesting about it was that you still care about that topic today, but I didn't understand that you didn't decide it yourself.
Yes. No, I mean it's an important question. Yeah, I don't know if I have any better answer today than I had back then, but clearly, if I said yes, then I was wrong.
You did say yes, but I think if you extrapolate it further,
Sure.
but what was interesting to me broader was that you were interested in speech and
Sure.
debate. And when I talked to Cody Sanchez, she said she wants her future child, to do speech and debate 100%. That's one of the most effective ways one can become a better human. And I thought that was an interesting insight. And I'd love to learn from your time doing that. What do you think about speech and debate, and how did that shape you into the person you are today?
That's a good question. I have a lot of respect for my high school speech and debate teacher, Julie Schneers. She was a great coach, and I still am not a terrific speaker or anything, but I am much better than I was before I started high school. And I had like a pretty bad speech impediment, and the organization, just doing the practice of debating and speaking helped out a ton. So I'm really grateful for that club. There's an interesting element to speech and debate where so every month there's a new topic, and you're forced to prepare a case to be able to debate the pro and the con side. And so there's an interesting thing where you had to learn how to argue both sides of the case. And this is positive and negative. I mean, like the good side is like you learn how to see both sides of the issue, yada yada yada. On the other hand, it's like a bit cynical in the sense that you're you're basically like teaching yourself how to justify anything you want, even if you don't believe it, right? And no wonder politicians are like always in speech and debate. So, but overall, I'd say like yeah, I'm really glad that happened. It's one of those things where my parents were really weren't happy with the amount of time I was spending in speech and debate, and they always thought like shouldn't you be doing something more directly applicable to your future career. And it's really hard to tell in advance what that will be, right? So I started a podcast in college, and being able to speak better is a big thing when you're podcasting.
Were you nervous about starting that, or had you, because of the speech impediment, or was that something you had already conquered?
In high school, I honestly don't remember. My memory of my past is like really bad. We just moved around so much that yeah, it's been fragmented a lot. But I think I started when I was in 10th grade, and I don't think I was that nervous because you're never really presenting in front of hundreds of people or anything when you start off, at least, right? You got to like get to finals or something before you're talking in front of a lot of people. So in the beginning, it's just you and like some kid's parent who's the judge, and the other person you're debating against. So yeah, I don't think I was nervous, and then you just ramp up from there. But there's never any point where you're like, oh, this is like a huge step change where I need to start getting nervous, you know?
Well, I want to talk about huge step changes because that is a part of your story, and particularly on April 14th, 2022, or April
Yeah.
13th, your life changed forever. And you go from 800 to 14 or 15,000 followers on Twitter. Take us through that experience and what it felt like in the moment.
Yeah, that was insane. So what happened was I wrote this blog post, and it went a little bit viral.
That's one way to put it.
Yes. So yeah, it actually was one of those things where I was like, oh my gosh, I've been writing this blog post for so long. I just need to get it out there.
How long did you spend on that blog post?
I don't know, like a week.
Gotcha.
But I want to get to the point where some of these writers, they just like write a thing and they publish it the same day, Matt Levine's things or whatever. But anyways, I was like, all right, I'm not gonna even like proofread this anymore. I'm done with this. Let's just put it out. I had like other ideas of where to take the post, other topics I wanted to cover, but I'm like, screw this. Let's publish it. And then so I just kind of forget about it. It gets like 20 likes in the first 12 hours on Twitter. And then somehow Mark Andreessen tweets about it. And then so, obviously that blows up. And then later that night, I get a DM from somebody. And they're like, hey, how do you know Jeff Bezos? And I'm like, what do you mean? I'm 21 years old. I don't know Jeff Bezos. And he's like, well, he follows you on Twitter. And he only follows 42 other people. And I was like, what? And then I go on his profile and check. It's like, oh, yeah, that's right. And then I post a photo of like that picture of like Jeff Bezos following me. And then somebody asked me on Twitter, dude, what? I'm like, yeah, I have no idea what's happening. And then so Jeff Bezos actually comments underneath it. He said some nice things. So, and then so after that happened, I went from 800 followers to, I don't know, for wherever I am now. And yeah, it was insane. It was an insane story.
How does that change how you then write and create in the future, knowing that one of the most powerful men in the world is watching you in some respect?
How does that change? I do think I've become too... I haven't published as much writing as I would like to since then. And I think that's been a problem. And I think it's because I've realized that now I'm talking to maybe an order of magnitude more people than I was talking to before, maybe even more than that. So I have, unfortunately, I think probably become too hesitant on the side of publishing things, which is ironic because one of the reasons he did follow me in the first place was this random blog post I wrote that had nothing to do with the main things I talk about. And so, yeah, I should. The lesson from the story is I should do more of that, right? And I've done less of that. So, in a way, I think I've taken the wrong lesson from it. But yeah, it has. And also, I mean, I spend more time on what I'm doing, and I work harder, and I take it more seriously. So, in that sense, it's definitely a positive. So, yeah, there's been multiple impacts on the way I think about my work from that.
And what about how people around you treat you? Does that become different?
Not really. Not at least in Austin. I had a good group of friends from before that happened, and our dynamic has not changed, which I'm really grateful for. We have a good time, and that change really hasn't impacted our day-to-day relationship at all.
Cool. Good to hear.
But when it also, but I mean, when I meet strangers, sometimes it makes a difference. Or stranger, not like complete strangers, but people who like know me through Twitter or something. But otherwise, yeah, day-to-day people, I'm grateful that there's no change.
Nice. And when you said you took the wrong lesson from it, what could you take from it in the future? Like what actions can you take now that would help create more of a future similar to the one you'd like to create?
I think just putting more stuff out there. This is something that Ben Kuhn, who's a blogger and a programmer, has written about. There's this thing in life where a lot of your biggest successes just happen from a small number of shots you take. It just like, if you think of the 20-80 rule or something like that. But you don't know what those are going to be, right? So you just had to take a bunch of shots. And so, you should just be like, that random blog post led to a lot of success, but it was just like one shot I took. The lesson from that, I think, should be that I should just take more shots. And I'll keep trying to do that. I should be clear that like I have done more interesting things since then, and I'm happy with many of the shots I've taken. But given how lucky I have been with the shots I have taken, I regret the ones I haven't taken even more. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Which haven't you taken? The fact just that you haven't been writing consistently?
Yeah. Well, writing is a small part of it, and then also just my degree's in programming, so just getting more into those kinds of projects. And then also have my own podcast, so booking guests. I'm pretty happy with what I've done since, but yeah, I maybe going on overdrive is something I wish I'd done more of.
What are the similarities between programming, writing, and podcasting?
Style. I think good programmers have a sense of style. There's a famous talk by Linus Torvalds, who's the creator of Linux, on YouTube, on TED or something. and he points out that the difference between a good programmer and a bad programmer. I think he had an example of a singly linked list, which anybody who's if you've like done basic programming, you'll be aware of what that is. But anyways, it's just like a basic thing that people program in their first year of college in computer science. And he points out two different ways you can write it. And one of them is written by somebody who has a good sense of style, and it's like really parsimonious. If you think of like a great essay, right? They make a point very simply. There's like a couple of sentences, they've introduced you to it, they've explained it clearly. And the other example is of just like, this spaghetti code. And again, there's like an analogy there with bad writing, which is, if you think of like an academic press book or something, right? They take like 5 paragraphs to say something you could have explained in a tweet. So, that sense of style is something that I think unites good writers and good programmers. And often you'll notice a lot of great programmers end up being great writers as well. It's a really strange coincidence.
And what about podcasting?
I don't know if there is a similarity, honestly, between programming and podcasting. So
interesting.
I'll have to think about that more, but I'm not sure if there is.
Well, I'd love to talk about the Lunar Society, your podcast. It seems like that's been your primary focus over the last 3 months, 6 months. It seems like from following you, you're really trying to double down on that area. Why?
You get to talk to a lot of interesting people. You get to talk to more and more interesting people over time, because you can always be like, would you like to come on my podcast, please? Where I've had the pleasure of interviewing so-and-so and so-and-so. And then the next person can be on your so-and-so list, we send out on your cold emails. The ability to learn from the smartest people in the world and ask them, pepper them with questions for 2 hours. It's totally underrated. There's some things you can't learn from podcasting, and that's why I want to also do other kinds of projects as well concurrently. But yeah, I mean, the amount you get to learn, the amount of people you get to talk to, it's as you know, it's it's great.
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I was watching your Sam Bankman-Fried episode that you did with him prior to coming here, and I normally listen at 1.5 or 2x speed, and I had to go back and listen at 1x for a lot of your questions and a lot of his answers. And I'm curious why you think that is.
I talk fast, which is one thing. The other is, when I started my podcast, I thought the only people who are listening are the people who are fans of the person I'm interviewing, right? Which means they're already going to be familiar with their basic ideas. Nobody's coming here because they saw my 100 Twitter follower profile and they were like, I got to check out his podcast. People here is like, I want to listen to what Tyler Cowen has to say or something like that. And so those people already know what Tyler Cowen has to say about the basic questions. So I don't want to ask the basic questions, right? I want to ask the things to somebody who's familiar with their ideas, who has read their books, who has done the kind of research I have, the kinds of questions that person would have. And this has the effect often of asking arcane questions that even I wouldn't have known what they're talking about like a week prior to the actual interview, because after the prep is when I've actually understood the context. And so obviously in a sense that's bad, because you're like not including the audience in the full context of what's happening. But I do find that enjoyable when I'm watching interviews and they're like talking about something I don't fully understand, but at least I know that the guest is interested and the interviewer is interested. They're asking a question they haven't heard the answer to before. So I'm trying to find the balance there. Obviously, I don't want to just ask like random weird questions that nobody knows what I'm talking about. But yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to ask questions that they haven't been asked before, that somebody who has read everything they've written would ask.
The Tyler Cowen approach, is how he ends up doing his interviews as well.
Right.
And you've interviewed Tyler twice, and gotten the pleasure of sitting down with him. And it seems like from researching your story that he's an inspiration to you and somebody who you put on a pedestal in a good way. What is it about Tyler Cowen that attracts you so much?
There's multiple things. He has an interesting perspective on almost anything you could ask him. People have said nice things about the interview afterwards, since it's happened, and they're like, "Oh wow, you asked really interesting questions," and so on. And I think a big part of it, honestly, is like I could have asked him anything. Like you think it's because I asked interesting questions. It's just no. I could have literally asked him anything, and he would have given an interesting response. So and that's not true of all guests, as you know. Like sometimes you ask something and it's not their exact thing they're studying, and they're just not going to give you an interesting answer. They might not even give you an answer at all.
Hmm.
And because he's so well read, because he's thought about everything, because he's talked to everybody, he just has like, what was the question I asked him? I think I asked him why he thinks society is going to collapse, and he said the fact that sex exists. And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, the fact that sex exists is the most pessimistic thing in the world because it suggests that you need to like constantly have more variation in order to survive in the environment. And so that's why. Like, all right, that's an interesting perspective, right? That's not what I was expecting when I asked the question.
Yeah. And you also have, similar to this, that the variation, you have this idea about high volatility or people who are highly volatile being the people that you should actually invest in. And I thought that was so fascinating. What's going on there?
Yes. So I think the title of the post was "Talent as Call Options" or something like that. Well, when you're investing, there's an instrument you can use called an option, and I think that is a great analogy for how to think about somebody's potential. So let me just back you up here and explain what I'm talking about. So imagine there's these two kids in high school, and I want you to tell me which one of them sounds more talented to you. One of them is the president of the National Honor Society. He's on the varsity tennis team. He was in the spelling bee when he was a kid, right? Like he's the president of every organization, every cookie cutter organization you can think of. And this is not an easy thing, right? It takes countless hours per week to do this. The other one, I don't know. He started a business in high school and he's making 4 figures a month. He maybe made a website. He's making websites for people who in the local area who need websites, right? This might even be like easier to do and take less time to do than being the president of all these organizations. But let me ask you, which one sounds more impressive?
Well, to me,
Yeah.
the second one does because I was the second one.
Oh, you were?
Well, I had a Knicks blog when I was 15 and a time management blog when I was 13. Didn't care about school. I was doing all these crazy
Interesting.
projects.
What were we doing?
I was interviewing NBA players, right?
Huh.
So it's like I knew that was more valuable,
Sure,
and I believe that was more valuable. But I saw a lot of kids go a different route of trying to appease and I thought those kids were awesome as well. But I'm curious to continue the story. What were you doing in high school that made you think about that analogy?
What was I doing in high school? Was I doing anything in high school? Let's see. I was doing speech and debate. I think overall, I was just reading a lot, thinking about things.
That doesn't sound volatile to me.
Yeah, you're actually right. Well, maybe this is not a great example. Maybe I wasn't doing anything that volatile. But let's say I was somebody like you.
I see what you've done there.
In that case, we want to explain why does the second person sound more interesting, and this goes back to options. This financial instrument, a call option, it gives you the right to buy an asset in the future at a price you determine now. And what is it that raises the price of an option? What would make you more willing to buy an option on a stock or something? You would want to buy an option on Bitcoin. That's going to be worth a lot. Why is that? Because Bitcoin is highly volatile, right? It could go to the moon by the time the option is exercised. And if it doesn't go to the moon, you don't lose that much. It's only the option, the price you paid for the option. But if it does go to the moon, you're going to make a ton of money. And so volatility is what we're looking for when if you're thinking of somebody who's like in high school who's like started a business. This person is really volatile. They could do some really interesting things in the future, right? This guy could start $1 billion business. The guy who's the president of like 4 clubs, he might work for his business. So yeah, so that's why I think volatility is something that we intuitively understand when we meet somebody young. This guy's like clearly off the. You can't just be like off your rocker, like doing heroin or something, right? You can't be that kind of volatile. But if you're volatile in an interesting way, that suggests the kind of potential you have that makes you more interesting to invest in for the same reason that we value volatility in financial markets, at least in certain contexts.
Yeah, well, but would that also play a part in the negative sense? Like, what are the negative ways in which someone could be volatile and that be a positive?
negative ways.
Do you understand what I'm saying? So like you're saying someone's starting a business, you're like, oh, in high school, that's volatile. That's the positive way we think about volatility. What negative ways of somebody doing some behavior would be volatile, and we'd be like, wow, that's so interesting. They could be a success later on. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, there's this like trope of a high SAT score kid but poor GPA kid, and the basic idea is that you're high in intelligence but low in conscientiousness. I think that's an interesting trope. It could just suggest you're lazy, which is not a good thing. But another possibility is that you're just like, you want to do more interesting things. You're bored of doing this. You would be bored of just like having a normal job. And this kind of person could, obviously start something cool when they're an adult, like go off the beaten path. So yeah, like somebody, that trope of a high SAT, low GPA kid.
That's cool. Yeah. I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
I want to talk about just what your vision and where you see the podcast going as your main vehicle. Do you want to write books in the future? Do you want to write computer science programs? Do you want to start businesses? Where does the vision for you land?
Yeah, probably a business or something like that. The podcast is great, but I do have the desire to do something more tangible, to like actually produce something people consume or want in some more tangible sense. So I think the future probably holds something like that. And the podcast is just a way to learn more about the world, to learn more about what's going on. But yeah, I think the ultimate thing would probably be something like leading a company or something like that. But it's so indeterminate at this point. I really don't know.
Yeah.
That's something I actually want to figure out over the next few months is what do I want to do?
How do you go about figuring that out?
I think you have to try a lot of things. And so I don't expect I'm going to figure it out in the next few months. I don't even think that's the maybe correct way to think about it, right? Because when are you most productive in your career? Probably when you're like in your 40s or something. And that's a far ways away, right? Until then, you're just building up a lot of skills. And so, yeah, like I think just trying a bunch of things for the next few years would be the most helpful thing to help me figure out where I want to go.
It's interesting that you say your 40s are your most productive years when the thesis of that blog post is in your 20s.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. For when you're doing something really cognitively intense, that's when your fluid intelligence peaks in your early 20s and starts to decline when you get in your 40s and 50s. So in that context, yeah, like if you're trying to be a great mathematician, you're not going to do your best work in your 40s. You're going to do your best work in your 20s. I probably am not going to be a great mathematician. So I'm not saying that I'm just going to waste the next 2 decades or anything. But it would be, don't you think it would be disappointing if you turn 40 and you realize I already did the most interesting things I'm going to do in my life and I'm only halfway through my lifespan?
That's how a lot of athletes are programmed to believe. And I think about this idea of like, are the best days behind me yet? I mean, I don't really think that often, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
No, yeah. Well, what makes you think that?
Well, my life has been pretty good, all things considered. And when you think about the collapse of civilization, and you think about like it's possible, right? It's possible that the world ends. So I do think about that. But from your perspective, what do you think? How do you think the next 50 years are going to go from a societal perspective?
I think they'll mostly be fine. Like, people have huge hyperboles about this thing's going to destroy society or something like that. And I don't know, like, overall, like, how much has really changed in the last 50 years? I mean, in some sense, a lot of things have happened, right? We've had, 9/11 and we've had the fall of communism. But if you were just living in America, it's just like, yeah, we got phones, we got computers. And other than that, like, what has really changed? So some things will get better, some things will get worse. I think overall things will get better. I think technology will get better, governance will get worse. But overall, I think things won't be that different.
Governance will get worse.
Yes.
Why do you say that?
Just public. So Mansur Olson was this economist who had this theory of public choice. And basically, he just academize something that a lot of us understand intuitively, which is if you have any institution, you'll have special interests who want to get special allowances for themselves. Maybe they ask for like a subsidy. Maybe they ask for like special allowance in the tax code, yada, yada, yada. All these things build up as kludge in the system. And overall, the system slows down. It has to accommodate more stakeholders. There's more and more rent seeking. And so, over time, the system degrades. If you think about the government 50 years ago, but it was like more competent in many ways. If you think about the kinds of things, the Apollo mission, it was a little more than 50 years ago, but Apollo mission, that was just like a bunch of 20 and 30-year-olds who were out of Kentucky who were running that thing. And if you go to the NASA today, do you think they could like pull something like that off again? Probably not. So hopefully we'll have new institutions come up who are able to take up some of that slack. But I think the main institutions, the governments and so on, I think they'll probably get a little bit worse. I don't want to over-exaggerate it, but yeah.
Mike Maples Jr. came on the podcast, and you should have him on yours. He's incredible thinker. And he had this idea of the way we look at the church today or the Pope today is similar to how people look at the president today, and how we respect its authority, but also understand that it's not as meaningful as it once was. And I just thought that was an interesting perspective when I asked him about, does it ever annoy him that he knows so many great people in technology and none of them are running the country? That was what he said to me.
Interesting. Yes. Yeah, it is shocking. If you think about like World War II, we had people like Leslie Groves, who was running the Manhattan Project. And he wasn't personally a scientist, but he was somebody who could understand the equations that people like von Neumann were writing on the board, right? He understood the actual physics and chemistry that was involved in constructing the bomb. You think today, I don't know if we had anything like that level of competence when dealing with COVID. And the thing is, we do have this like cluster of competence and talent in places like Silicon Valley. You think about like how well a company like Apple is run, right? If the government was run as well as Apple, I think it would run a lot better, right? But for some reason, there's not those people don't go into they probably just think like, yeah, well, even if I did go into the government, it's just too messed up for me to do anything about it. And maybe they're right.
I heard you mention on a previous podcast about how Apple is 2 times bigger than the British Empire was at its peak.
Oh, yes. What was so the GDP of the British Empire in the 1880s was, I don't remember the exact statistic off the top of my head, but I think it was
60 billion. Is that right?
Okay. But
I don't know for sure.
Yeah. But, and then I think Apple's annual revenue is twice that or something. So yeah, it makes a little bit of sense just that the economy has grown over time. So obviously, the British government today is bigger than the British government was back at the time, even though it's lost the empire. But it is astounding to think about how big these companies actually are. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, like these companies actually run really well. They're highly functional, so I think they should be bigger, if anything. But they're pretty big.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about. Just we got this MacBook here, we got iPhones, and how much they run our world, and how much we are relying on them. How do you think of the reliance we have on technology, building that into the system, and then eventually having to, what if we can't use them at some point? What if it gets taken away from us?
I think that's always a challenge, right? I don't know if it's necessarily true of modern technologies. Like, you could say the Romans, if they lost their aqueducts, and they might have if they went into disrepair, or if they got lead poisoning or something, well, then they're screwed, right? They're not going to have any water. And so it's like, yeah, but still build the aqueducts, That might happen, but it's better than having no aqueducts the entire time. So, it's possible that we lose what we have, and that, are we over-reliant on it? I don't know. I think we've all the things we think of as technology today weren't the same things we think of as technology before. And so you think you're over-reliant on your MacBook, but you get to take hot showers, there's indoor plumbing. All these things are technology as well, right?
Yeah.
You have, we're in Texas. You could not stand this weather if we didn't have indoor cooling and heating. In fact, I actually do wonder, the first people who first settled here, how did they endure the summers? I actually don't understand. Like, how would they just like collapse in the middle of the day? Yeah, I have no idea, but yeah, there's a lot of other technology.
It's interesting how technology ceases to become technology after it becomes accepted,
Mhm.
and then it doesn't become. Uh, it's not something that people rail against. Like, for example, radio.
Mhm.
There are headlines that are saying like the 1920s and 30s, radio is going to be the death of children, and they're not going to because of the new technology.
Mhm.
And inevitably, every new technology gets pounded on by media, and then it just becomes normal, and then it's not even technology anymore.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, there's this point, I forget the book that the point was made in, but the author was making the point that whenever new technology comes up, it's competing against there's some settled order, right? People have positions and power in the existing order, and the nature of technology is to shake things up, to maybe make older forms of doing things irrelevant or inefficient, and therefore these existing rent seekers are gonna want to demonize the new developments. You see this in some ways with social media, who are like direct competitors to news companies. But I think, yeah, this has historically probably been true, and that's why we just think of the new thing as something that's gonna mess things up, because it probably is gonna mess things up for a few people, at least in the short term.
Why do you think you yourself are so drawn towards technology in the future?
If you think over the course of history, what has really made people's lives better?
Hmm.
I think often when we talk about history, people really fixate on wars and the big events of history, the revolutions. Was it Will Durant or somebody else who had this quote that the best periods of history are the empty pages in the book of history,
Huh.
where nobody's like talking about those periods because it's like just 100 years of peace and people's lives like, gradually became better. Maybe they invented a better hoe or something for tilling. But yeah, so there's an alternative history you could tell where you're just thinking about when did we get bifocals so that people could see? When did we be able to sanitize water? When did we, or when did we develop the smallpox vaccine with cowpox? If you just include all these things, I think you could tell maybe the history wouldn't be as sexy, right? There's not wars or something, but it would be more true to what has really mattered to people's well-being over time. It's just been better technology. It's empowerment through those kinds of things. So, yeah.
So, how do you want your life to be remembered? As somebody who made the world a better place for more people?
I don't know if I think as I get older, I'll probably think more about that. I'm not even sure, like, who is really even remembered. I know this is a point that people often make, and I think it's like kind of true, which is that probably nobody's gonna remember almost anybody unless you're like a Shakespeare. Maybe like a couple people alive today will get remembered. Actually, on the other hand, Scott Alexander, I don't know if you're familiar with that blogger.
Yeah.
He had this interesting blog post. In the future, everybody will be famous to 15 people.
Mm.
So the basic premise of the blog post is, if you think about the ancient Greeks, if you think about the famous ones like Aristotle or something, there's like entire departments that are dedicated to studying one person, right? And part of the reason we can do that is just because there's a lot more people alive today than there were back then. I think he said that there are more people today who have like majored in or are studying ancient Greece than there were citizens in Athens in ancient
Wow.
Greece. Or I don't remember this
Approximately.
accurate, but like that could be true.
Like everything on this podcast. Could be true. Fact check us.
That should just be the description of iTunes, Apple Podcast, the App Store.
Or just the name of the title of the podcast. It could be true.
Yes.
Presented by Danny Miranda.
I don't just mean about your podcast. I just mean like podcasting in general.
Yeah.
But yeah, so in the future, maybe these will have a whole bunch of AIs, and there could be like trillions of them, right?
Yeah.
And they'll need something to do.
Yeah.
Some of them will actually do like science and technology, and some of them will make flip burgers.
Yeah.
But then we'll just have trillions of other ones who need to study history, and they can't all study the same thing. So maybe a few of them will just like study who's a random person who nobody's ever studied. We'll like start a department about Danny Miranda, and then this person will specialize in early Danny Miranda history. This person will specialize in teenage Danny Miranda. This person will study the Marxist interpretation of Danny Miranda's history. This one will study the feminist interpretation. So, I don't
Sounds
know.
like a waste of time.
Yeah, but we have them today, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is interesting. Just like one thing I find about the future is like our predictions are often so
Hmm.
wrong, and the things that people are worried about are so off a lot of the times, and it just gives me a lot of peace in the present moment of the things that we're worried about today are probably going to get solved, and maybe that's the naiveness in me that's like I don't want to even attempt to
Mm,
tackle this issue. But I also find that people were worried about overpopulation,
yeah.
and now we're worried about underpopulation, and it's like, are we just populated at the right amount?
One thing I think is interesting is that people will often understand that a thing is a problem, but so they'll just understand something is important, but they'll just get the direction on it exactly opposite.
Yeah.
So population has always mattered in history. And so people were, I mean, bound to be right when they predicted that population will matter in the future, right? They were just completely wrong about which direction it mattered in. This is something I think a lot about when people make a lot of predictions about AI, for example, how it will change the world. Actually, let me go back and say that maybe the reason I think the future might be actually a lot different is if some of these AI forecasts are correct. Yeah, so maybe in 50 years, actually, things will be completely different, more different than you could ever imagine.
Probably.
But, but so people are thinking about like what should happen when AI comes, right? Who should be in charge? How, like, what is the utopia we're hoping for? And they're also like worried about the problems that could come up if there is AI. And then I don't know, like I don't think we have a good track record
Mm.
of being able to identify what those problems will be in advance. So yeah, I think the underpopulation and overpopulation is a great example of that.
Yes. So like let's say like a lot of people right now are saying like we're underpopulated. But I heard you talking to Pom about how we could clone people.
Hmm.
So if we're underpopulated, we could just clone some people, right? And it'd be fine.
Yeah, the thing is, will we do that?
If it's that bad, we probably would.
Maybe. I don't even know if we would then.
Hmm.
Like, which government is going to take the responsibility of cloning an extra billion people?
Hmm.
Uh,
That sounds like a lot.
yeah, which is so. Yeah, I'm not sure actually that I think those technologies will help a lot, like cloning and embryo selection and things like that. Help more people have babies and stuff. Or I mean, IVF in general. But or embryos that are outside the uterus. Uh, but yeah, I'm not sure if anybody will actually take the mantle. So I don't want to rely on the technology alone for solving underpopulation.
Hmm. What are the most important problems from your perspective?
I, I would say AI probably. I don't know. I think there's a 20% chance it's the most important problem. But if that 20% is correct, it's just so much a bigger problem than all the other problems
Hmm.
that it's still worth focusing a lot on. The problem is, I don't know if I've encountered any person who really has a compelling vision of what the world should look like after AI, how you go about making that happen. So, yeah, it's not comforting to know that the biggest problem is one that we don't really have a good grasp on or we don't have a good understanding of how to think about. But I would say AI at the moment because it could get much smarter. It could get much smarter than humans. I think the existing models you see in the world, they could get much bigger and are probably kind of scalable. So we'll see.
I wonder what the previous example is for AI. Like in the past, what did people see coming that scared them that was similar? Was it the internet? Was it cell phone? Like what in the past were people very worried about would be the end, and how did they deal with that in that situation? Do you have any
Mm.
ideas?
There's a lot you could come up with. Uh, you could say something like the Industrial Revolution.
Mm.
Not that it was the end, but some people did predict this is going to completely change how the world works, how the economy works. If you can have these machines that make each other better over time, there's a feedback loop of economic growth that allow more people to be fed, which means that more people can do more innovations, which means that they can build better machines. Some people, I think, could have predicted that. The problem is, if you look at some of these predictions, a lot of them are suggest diagnoses that are very bad. So you think somebody like Karl Marx, he saw how the Industrial Revolution could grow, right? In some ways, he was a great economic thinker. In some very particular ways, was what I'm saying. But then obviously his diagnosis was disastrous. And I do wonder, I actually asked Charles Mann this, who is a historian who studies Native Americans, you know, in the period before the Europeans arrived. He's written a few books on that. And I asked him, how did they think about what would happen, what is happening as these people are arriving? They're getting decimated by disease. They're losing all these battles. There's like these huge beasts they've never seen before, horses, right? You don't realize how scary that would look to somebody who's never seen a horse before. And there's somebody riding on top of this beast. And so, yeah, it's spiritual explanations maybe is part of how they reacted. But that's something like that, right? Something you would have never seen before, and you had to like figure out how to wrap your head around this new emergency.
So you said AI is 20% of the problem, or 20% chance of.
I just went out of a whole rant on you.
Yeah. No, I know.
I don't know where we started, but yeah.
No, it started with AI and where AI and the potential problems we have.
Mm-hmm.
You said that was a 20% chance. What is the other 80?
Nuclear war is probably a big one. The fact that economic growth could continue to slow around the world, and there's just not that many new interesting technologies that come about. Something that's correlated to that is that one of the ways we deal with the sclerosis and the worsening of government institutions, as we talked about, is that the private sector continues to make innovations that get better over time. So even though there are rent seekers, the pie grows enough that they can continue to collect rents and we can still have plenty. But if there's not economic growth, then the rent seekers could just gobble up the remaining resources. But yeah, nuclear war is something that obviously is on everybody's mind given the Ukraine thing. And over 100 years or however long we live, could that, what are the odds that something like this doesn't happen again? And at this time, the nukes do go off.
One thing I think about a lot is that the odds of something unbelievable happening over a day is very unlikely. A week, very unlikely. A month, unlikely. A year, less likely. A decade, almost certainly one thing will happen that is incredibly unexpected. Over a lifetime, almost 100%.
Right.
So we haven't seen, so in my lifetime, I've seen 9/11 and COVID being two of those things that have been very unlikely, let's say. Maybe unlikely by the normal person's perspective. It's like, I haven't seen nuclear war. I haven't seen, and you would expect that if it's at least one a decade, then we're going to see some more crazy shit.
I think that's very likely true.
You think that the unlikely events happening is very likely?
Yes.
Yeah, I
and
do too.
in that sense, it's scarier because it could be a thing we're not even
Thinking
worried about.
Right.
Yeah.
No one was worried about planes going into
Exactly.
the Twin Towers in 2001.
Exactly.
No one could have said that in July. That's the major threat to the country.
Exactly. And I guess people saw something like COVID coming. A few people saw something like
Bill
COVID.
Gates talked about it a lot.
Right. But it wasn't something I was worried about.
Right. Me too.
So some people could see the next thing coming, but maybe it will never occur to me until the actual event occurs.
Yeah. There was a movie I watched on this where
Contagion,
someone...
yeah.
What?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, about how someone knew that an asteroid was coming, but they couldn't tell the world and no one would believe them. I don't know what the name of it was, but...
The one with Leonardo DiCaprio,
yes,
right?
the one with Leonardo DiCaprio.
Yeah.
But it just makes you think, like, what does that make you think?
I don't know. It makes you feel... It's a very tragic situation in a way, right? I think that the next thing that's coming, people are already warning us about it. But how do you figure out who those people are? There's so many esoteric problems where you got to first catalog all of them. Then you had to find out who is the person to believe, because in all these cases, there are always people who are saying the other thing. And I guess it sounds like, the Gates Foundation probably did something like that. There are other people who have probably done something similar. Just make a catalog of all the threats, see who are the most credible people, and then see what can be done. But yeah, I'm not that person, so I have no idea what's going to happen next.
And what's so great about it all, about what you're describing, is like we can catalog all the problems, but your prediction, and mine as well, and not qualified to give it personally, but is that the world is going to get better.
I see what you're saying. If I don't even know what the tail risk is. How can I say that I know that it's not going to make the world worse in some way? And yeah, I think there's a good point there. So maybe I'm counting that in the 80% of worlds where something terrible doesn't happen in the next 50 years, things are going to be overall better.
Well, also that something terrible could happen and we could also get better. Is a hypothesis I don't think we think a lot about.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess that happened with 9/11, right?
Right. People came together, and in COVID too, it's like it instilled a sense of community amongst the world that didn't exist prior, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Oh, and also, like, how bad was it in the long scheme of things?
Mhm.
We recovered after that. If you think of like 9/11, it's not like Osama was able to establish a global caliphate or anything, right? He launched some bombs. He, started a ragtag group in the caves. We bombed them out, and we wasted a bunch of money and lives. But overall, like, not that much has changed because of 9/11. So it could be the next thing that happens. In the moment, it's very bad, but over time, we just kind of recover and things still continue to improve.
You mentioned before about how most people don't get remembered. Does that thought make you feel depressed or excited, or how does that feeling of like a lot of what we're doing, no one's going to remember it?
Yeah, it does raise the stakes in the sense that if you think nobody's going to remember you, then the way you leave some impression is just by changing how things turn out so that nobody can credit you, but you can know that I left an indelible mark on the way things turn out. So I don't know, if you build a great company that allows people to do cool things and live better lives, or if you're a philanthropist or something, you still probably won't get remembered, but you can know that you probably made a difference that will persist even after you're dead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what I often think about is the people on the day to day. It's not like they'll remember you, but you can leave someone with a positive impact, and you could feel that yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So I have some quotes I'd love to talk to you about.
Go for it.
Yeah. This is on great men. I would like to say that great men, technological and economic development, and randomness are underrated, while great ideas, group conflict, and geography are overrated. I thought that was a fascinating way to break that down. You said great men, technological and economic development, and randomness are underrated, while great ideas, group conflict, and geography are overrated. This comes from Anselmo Berge's Great Founder Theory, a blog post you read.
Yes.
You wrote. Just a throwaway line that I thought was fascinating. I was like, what does he mean by this? And Brian, you read it. You wrote it months ago, and you're like, I didn't think anyone ever read it.
Actually, let me remember. So great ideas, great men, and technological changes are underrated.
Great men, technological and economic development.
Okay.
And randomness.
Yes. Yeah, I'll still endorse that.
Why are great men underrated?
So I think it's maybe they're not underrated. Like, I think we do when we talk about history, we do emphasize a lot of these key figures. Maybe what I mean is not the great men are underrated, but certain great men or women who have been forgotten are underrated. People who are, we remember people like Napoleon, right? And obviously it was very important how history turned out. Even I don't know the name of the guy who engineered the Roman aqueducts or something like that. So in that sense, that must have been a person who did that. And I don't know who that is. And that person was very important. And then technological changes. Yeah, I think we already talked about like why I think those are super underrated. But I think also in history, there's just a bunch of randomness and a whole bunch of contingency. Things could have turned out very differently. And the whole course of future events could be shaped by that. And we don't really... We like to think that there's a certain historical process or reason that things turn out the way they did. And I think a lot of that is just random.
I loved what Tyler Cowen said, I believe, on your podcast about, and I think Rob Henderson did a quote tweet about it, which was just about how, can you remind me what it was exactly about?
The travel?
how if you traveled to places
Yes.
and versus you reading about it
Yeah.
is completely different.
Right. Because I asked Tyler what he thinks the difference is between traveling to a place that exists today versus just reading about a time in history. Do you think they're qualitatively different experiences?
Yeah.
And his answer was, the thing about reading about history is you just really don't know what happened. Like when you travel to a place, you're like, oh, I know that the stand is right there and this person is there and like this is what their culture looks like. With history, who knows, right? You can read like numbers from Herodotus and it's like Xerxes marched with 1,000,000 men or something. And it's like, were there really 1,000,000 men? So yeah, it's that is something that I'm actually kind of sad about when you read about history and you just realize we'll never know about this stuff. Like I can read all these books, but it's a lot of these things like it would be so great to know and we'll never know. Their stories are lost forever.
Yeah. And also like feeling the culture of the place or feeling the
Yes.
way it lands on you personally based on your experience. We'll never, but maybe we will figure out a way to do that in the future of like capturing what a place feels like. I mean, video is a much better medium. Someone could much better feel like being in the room, this room right here, than we would if we wrote back and forth about it or had a transcript.
Yes. So in that sense, starting from now, because of the fact that everybody's always recording things, it would be pretty easy for future VR engineers to be able to manufacture environments based on what the world looked like in the 21st century. And I think we would probably have a lot of photographs of different places in the 20th century that we could reconstruct. I wonder if things like ancient Egypt are just lost forever, or if we have enough artifacts remaining from those times that somebody who is a dedicated historian could set up like something in the Oculus where you could actually experience the place and the period. Most importantly, like the people, you know, like what was a natural way they would, because I don't really care about the pottery at the time, but I'm curious, like how would people react to different things? You know, what did their daily routine look like? So maybe those things were lost forever, which would be a shame.
How does it feel that you're living through the printing press of video and audio?
Yeah, Bern Hobart had an interesting post about this where we're living in an era where people can take videos of anything, but we haven't gotten to the point where video is always recording everywhere. So when the video starts recording, it's after something has already happened that like made the person think I should start videoing it. So you never know. You don't never know the most important moment, which is like the moment the person was like, "Oh, something is happening. Let me start taking a video." That moment is lost forever. And so we have this bias in terms of when we consume things. We always lose the original moment. In the future, that'll be gone. But yeah, it's an interesting moment we're living in. For the same reason, we have a lot more context, right? Like I think I have a better sense of what it's like to be in like Taiwan or something because video makes it so much more salient.
Super cool. And then for the parts that were overrated, you said great ideas, group conflict, and geography. Why are those things overrated?
By great ideas, I mean philosophers. Do I endorse this anymore? I don't know if I do. Maybe I don't actually.
It's all good. You don't have to. You can change your mind.
But so by great ideas, I mean philosophers, thinkers, and I think most of them are still probably overrated because the people who write books are the kinds of people who are obsessed with great thinkers, and they probably overrate because they want to be a great thinker themselves, so they tend to overrate those kinds of things. I do think a lot of intellectuals have actually had a big influence on history, often in a bad way. So this is not a vindication of intellectuals. And yeah, so I think I might want to take that back. Most of them are overrated, but a few of them have had a huge impact. If you think of like how our government works, that was probably the result of a few intellectuals having certain thoughts about how it should work. Many of them were kind of naive thoughts, but you know, people instituted them, right? And it worked. Great. What was the second one?
Group conflict.
Yeah. That I think it just like we're evolved to think in terms of conflicts. So again, this goes back to us just always obsessing over like historical wars and things, and we looking back on it, it's like, who cares if the Assyrians or the Hittites controlled this region of the Middle East? 4,000 years later. At the time, for them, they probably thought it was the most important thing that was happening at the time. Looking back, it's like they're basically the same people. Who cares, right?
What's the modern day equivalent of that? Like liberals versus conservatives?
Maybe, or something like in the long scheme of things, like who controls the Donbass region of Ukraine.
Mm,
It's like the most important story at the moment. But it's like a few, how many square miles is that?
mm,
So the long scheme of things is probably not that important. That kind of
interesting.
thing, yeah.
And geography goes into
Ye-
that piece as well.
yeah, but by geography I mean more in terms of there's this theory that Jared Diamond is most famous for, which in Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is that certain nations have a lot of resources. They have a lot of beasts of burden that they can domesticate. They have a lot of iron. And since if you have those things, you can kickstart an agricultural revolution, which will make you much wealthier. And for that reason, these countries have ended up being wealthier. I think that people tend to overrate geography as an explanation for why certain nations have succeeded and others have failed.
Hmm.
That's what I was referring to there.
Cool. No,
Yeah.
that makes sense. And it's crazy. I don't know exactly when you wrote that,
Yeah.
but is it interesting to you since you're also at the point in your life where so many of your ideas are going to get changed and so many of your ideas are going to grow and become different? Do you ever look at your writing 6 months in the past and be like, wow, like I'm a different thinker at this point, particularly because I've spoken to so many people who have updated
Yes.
my thinking?
I do that all the time.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm trying to teach myself to be less sure and less confident when I'm speaking in terms of like being like, oh, this is definitely what I think. Because 2 months ago, I probably wouldn't have told you that answer about AI, but I talked to Holden Karnofsky, who's the um, a CEO of Open Philanthropy. They're trying to give like a bunch of money to like make sure AI goes well. And after talking with him and researching for that interview, I'm like, oh yeah, it's actually very important. And that was like 2 months, right?
Yeah.
Or less than that. So yeah, I could have completely different ideas in 2 months, and then I might say something that Danny, you might be like, actually, I don't know if I want to be associated with him anymore, given the new things he's saying. But yeah,
And when people are going to check out your podcast after this Lunar Society, a lot of people ask me all the time, like, who's your favorite guest? And it's a very difficult question. I don't think I've ever given a good answer. But for you, what's the guest or what podcast that you've put out do you think deserves more love than it has gotten?
Oh, interesting. That's a good way of putting the question. Like an episode,
Yeah.
Austin Vernon. I think that one did actually pretty well. It was a recent one. This guy's a genius engineer who has a blog on the internet, austinvernon.site, and I interviewed him on my podcast because it's kind of a strange, or not a strange, but an esoteric topic. This guy writes about what will happen when solar and battery tech gets order of magnitude better, and now we have energy superabundance. What can we do? Can we dig tunnels everywhere? Can we have drones that are getting us like our morning coffee? Um, he has a blog post about using the Starship, Elon Musk Starship, and just putting some tungsten on that and just using that as a weapon. No explosives. You just launch like rods of tungsten at your enemy, and because of the kinetic force of that, it just like blows up entire cities.
Oh my God.
Anyway, so he just like has all these kinds of interesting things. It was interesting to talk to him. He does a polymath. So I don't know if I'd say that's my best podcast. It was like certainly one of my favorites, but it was definitely underrated because nobody knows who, or a few people know who that guy is, right? So, yeah, I really like that one.
How do you feel when people are in the comments of your podcast and saying, this is the next Lex Friedman?
I really appreciate them saying that, but I don't know if I'm trying to do what Lex is trying to do. I love I love the fact that people are enjoying my podcast, which is the main thing I take out of that. And so yeah, it makes me feel really happy.
Well, what are you trying to do and what is Lex trying to do?
I don't want to say anything negative about him at all. I've enjoyed many of the interviews he's done, but maybe I'm trying to do something a little more I try to interview my guests, try and ask them very specific questions, often questions that maybe a general audience wouldn't maybe not enjoy, and that's fine. But I'm trying to really ask them about the most interesting, specific things I could find by reading through everything that they've published or said. And there are a few people who interview like that, but that's the one I enjoy doing most.
Who interviews like that you aspire to be like?
Tyler, I think,
Yeah.
is the obvious one. I don't know if there's actually that many who do it that way, but yeah, I think it's it actually might be bad for the audience. Like for the audience, they might just prefer like, who is this guy, right?
Yeah.
But it's less interesting for me because what I'm trying to get out of the podcast is I want to learn as much as I can. And the way I do that is I do all the prep I possibly can based on publicly available information. And after that's exhausted, I want to ask him the questions that I can't find anywhere, that he's never answered before, or that are not addressed. Often, I mean, a lot of these podcasts, I don't know if you watch them and you're like, this is just like the intro chapter to his book. Like, why did you ask? You just asked him like, what is your book about? And might you write it? It's like that's covered in the intro chapter of his book, right? Like, why didn't you ask him something more interesting, or her? So yeah, that's my goal, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you seem to be doing a great job of it, and I certainly enjoyed the episodes that I listened to, and on my way to get to know you better. And I'm really grateful for you taking the time here today. And if there was one final challenge you would like to leave people with on their way to do the next thing in their life or their day, what challenge would you give people? Because I feel like this is a good way to get to know what you really care about and what you want people to take away.
Yeah. And by the way, let me say I actually have listened to like a few of your episodes as well, and I've enjoyed them as well. So
Thank you.
Keep up the good work. This is an interesting question. There was this like famous study that the Freakonomics guys did. Are you familiar with this one?
I don't know where you're going. I love the Freakonomics guys.
Yeah. Where they asked people, I think it was Levitt, where they asked people, they had one group of people, they had a group of people who were trying to decide whether to make a specific change in their life or not. So they were genuinely unsure, right? Should I move to this new place? Should I get this new job? Like, should I quit my job and try this new job? So things like that. And so for one group, they just had them do whatever they were going to do anyways. And usually people just kept doing the thing they were already doing because of status quo bias. And the other group, they said, flip this coin. And based on the coin flip, if it comes up heads or whatever, you'll do the thing that you're considering doing. And so they're just like 50-50. Those people were just like forced to do the thing. And those people on average were much happier when they interviewed them in the future.
Wow.
So just, I don't know, if you're considering doing something, just do it. You know, just flip a coin. If it comes up heads, just go do it. Or maybe just do it regardless of what the coin says. Let me see. What would I be doing if I flip? I think I would quit the podcast. Actually, this is what I might be doing. But we'll see. We'll see.
You'd quit the podcast. We can't leave on that note. Why would you quit the podcast? You're so good at it, and you ask such great questions.
Not quit, but if stop doing it full time and work on something technical and tangible. You know, like how I said I would want to do that in the future, but why wait for the future? Why not just start doing it like as soon as possible? So once I finish my scheduled interviews, that's something I've been thinking more and more is maybe I just want to focus on a more tangible problem full time.
Beautifully said to end the podcast. I hope we see you and continue to watch your star grow and watch your thoughts. I hope you still share your thoughts while you're on your path to doing your next thing, or maybe continue the podcast. Who knows? For my enjoyment. But thank you for joining me here today. I really appreciate you.
And likewise, Danny, thanks for having me on. And looking forward to seeing more of your episodes.
Hell yeah.